John Carter's journey that day was supposed to be a simple, joyous reunion with family. But what unfolded at the airport turned into an experience that shook him to his core. Little did he know, his past, his service, and even the very essence of his being were about to be put under a harsh and unjust spotlight. The security officers, having noticed his military demeanor and posture, began to scrutinize him more intensely. He didn't think much of it at first. He was used to being questioned and doubted. After all, as a former Marine, that was just part of the life he led. But as the minutes ticked by, his patience began to wear thin. What was once a routine airport check suddenly felt like an interrogation. It started small, just a few questions about his travels. But then the officers began digging deeper, asking invasive questions about his background, his service, and his reasons for returning home after so many years. John answered them calmly, as he always did, knowing that his military service had been a testament to his loyalty and honor. However, the situation quickly escalated. The officers, now growing more skeptical, made unfounded accusations about his intentions. John's confusion turned into frustration. Why was he being treated like a criminal? His heart sank when they began to check his bag more thoroughly, pulling out items he had packed in preparation for his trip home. He tried to explain that they were just simple personal items, nothing more. Yet the officers seemed determined to paint him as a potential threat. The scene grew more tense, drawing the attention of bystanders. Whispers filled the air, and John's frustration turned to humiliation. Despite his years of serving his country with honor, he felt helpless. In that moment, he had given his youth to protect a nation that now seemed to treat him as an enemy in his own homeland. But this wasn't just about one man's suffering. It was about a system that had failed him, a system where people who had sacrificed everything were now facing doubt and discrimination. John's heart burned with the realization that this was more than a personal ordeal. It was a reflection of the deeper issues within society, the racial profiling, the stereotyping, and the injustice that so many faced, especially people who didn't fit the narrow mold society often tried to cast them in. As John was escorted to a private room for further questioning, his thoughts swirled with anger and disappointment. He thought of the countless individuals who had gone through similar experiences, those who were judged by their skin color or their past, rather than who they truly were. His mind began to clear, and what once felt like an insurmountable burden now felt like an opportunity. In that moment, John made a choice. He decided that he would not let this humiliation define him. Instead, he would use it as a platform to spark change. He would speak up, not just for himself, but for all those who had been silenced, marginalized, and misunderstood. His pain would become his strength. Through his journey, John would learn that even in the darkest moments, there was potential for growth and transformation. It wasn't just about the injustice he faced that day. It was about using that moment to build a better future, one where everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, was treated with the respect they deserved. The next few days would be pivotal. John would rise above the humiliation and begin to find ways to channel his anger and hurt into actions that could reshape society's views. His story would spread, touching hearts and minds and inspiring others to take a stand. What began as a nightmare at the airport would soon become the spark for a movement that would challenge stereotypes, confront racism, and fight for a world where no one had to feel like a criminal in their own home. And as for John, he would never forget that moment, the one where his pain became his purpose. Officer James, a young white officer, appeared nervous as he walked into the security checkpoint. At around 30 years old, he tried to assert his authority, but his eyes betrayed him. He was scanning the crowd, but his gaze lingered a little too long on those who didn't look like him. His eyes finally settled on John Carter, and the change in his expression was immediate. "Sir?" James called stiffly, his voice tight. "Come, here." John, whose calm demeanor had already attracted attention, looked up slowly. His eyes met James's, steady and unflinching, offering no signs of anger or surprise. Instead, John simply shrugged and walked toward the scanner when asked, following the officer's request without protest. But this time, things were different. James ordered John to raise his hands for a metal detector check. The machine beeped, but there was nothing unusual. That should have been the end of it. Instead, James insisted, "Open your backpack." John's frown deepened, his patience beginning to wear thin. "What's wrong?" "I went through the scanner already," he responded, though his tone remained controlled. James, without a hint of empathy or explanation, replied curtly, "Just checking." His eyes never met John's directly. John opened his backpack, revealing the mundane contents: clothes, a book, and a small box that held his medals from his time in the Marine Corps. James grabbed the box, flipping it over, then sneered, "Medals? Are you a hero or something?" John's gaze didn't waver, his voice calm and unwavering. "Yes, I was a Marine. This is a souvenir from those days." But instead of respect, James snorted and chuckled dismissively. "So, you're used to security checks, huh? Just keep quiet and cooperate." His words stung, but John didn't let it show. Around them, a few passengers began to notice the tension. An elderly woman whispered to her husband, "He doesn't look like a troublemaker." But John's patience had begun to fray. His calm eyes sharpened, and he finally spoke, his voice firm but controlled. "I've been cooperative from the beginning, but you're overdoing it." James, uninterested in John's complaint, called over another attendant for a more thorough check of John's luggage. The conveyor belt halted, and the long line of waiting passengers grew more restless. Some began to murmur, their annoyance directed not at John, but at the officer. "This is an abuse of power," a young man said softly, but his words carried far enough for everyone to hear. John's eyes never left James. His voice, low and firm, cut through the growing tension. "Look, you have the right to do your job, but the way you're treating me is not right." In that moment, John knew this wasn't just about a simple security check. It was about something much deeper. It was about the way people like him were often treated, about how society had a tendency to judge based on appearances or assumptions rather than reality. It wasn't just the officer's actions that hurt, it was the larger systemic issue of discrimination and racial profiling. Though John remained composed, his frustration burned inside him. It wasn't just the inconvenience or the humiliation, it was the principle. And as the crowd grew more uncomfortable with James's conduct, John felt something shifting within him, an undeniable desire to stand up for what was right. He knew he couldn't just let this moment pass. His experience, his pain, and his determination were about to ignite a bigger conversation. James, oblivious to the growing scrutiny from the onlookers, continued with his invasive search. But it was clear that the situation had become something far greater than a routine check. And John, though still being treated unfairly, had begun to realize that he could be the catalyst for change, not through anger, but through the quiet strength he carried with him. As John continued to endure the unnecessary scrutiny, he knew the story of his struggle would resonate far beyond the airport. It was a story that reflected not just his own experiences, but those of countless others who had been unjustly targeted, marginalized, and overlooked. It was time for those stories to be heard, loud and clear, and John was ready to lead that charge. John Carter's frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior, and as he stood there, facing James, the injustice of it all continued to gnaw at him. He was just a normal man, someone who had served his country, who had sacrificed so much to protect it. And yet here he was, treated with suspicion and hostility, as if he were the enemy. "I am just a normal man," John stated, his voice steady but firm. "There is no reason to be treated like this." James chuckled dryly, his gaze averted, clearly uncomfortable. "Just follow orders if you don't want trouble. Keep quiet." The tension in the air was palpable now. Passengers had started to notice the escalating situation, and several had taken out their phones, recording the incident. John could feel the weight of their eyes, but it wasn't the scrutiny that bothered him. It was the blatant injustice he was enduring in his own country, the very place he had bled and fought to protect. This wasn't a battlefield, it was an airport, but the fight he faced here felt just as real. "Do you know what you're doing?" John's voice, though still calm, now held a sharp edge. "I'm not the guy you want to mess with." Before James could respond, a middle-aged woman in a security uniform approached. Supervisor Susan Clark, her expression stern, stepped into the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked. James stood up straighter, clearly nervous. But before he could explain, a passenger nearby spoke up. "This policeman is giving him a hard time for no reason. He's been checking him for more than 15 minutes without any valid reason." Susan turned to John, her tone apologetic. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. We'll take care of this right away." John looked at her and nodded, but remained silent. He didn't have to say much. His silence spoke volumes. Susan immediately directed James to stop the search and to take John to a private area for identity verification. James, still muttering, under his breath, was sent away with a sharp command from Susan. "I'll handle this. Go back to your post." In the private area, Susan began to examine John's papers, asking about his itinerary. After a few minutes, her eyes fell on the medal in his backpack. "You're John Carter, former Marine, Bronze Star, and Silver Star recipient," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Yes," John replied shortly. Susan's face flashed with remorse. "I'm truly sorry. This was a terrible mistake on our part." John met her eyes, his voice steady but full of conviction. "It's not your fault, but your staff needs better training. I don't deserve this treatment and no one does." Susan nodded solemnly. "I promise to report the incident and handle it seriously. Once again, I apologize for what happened." John stood in silence for a moment, then stood up, ready to leave. But the incident wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he left the private area, John couldn't shake the feeling that something more was brewing. The concerned looks from the passengers around him and the whispers in the air made it clear that this moment wouldn't be forgotten. As he moved through the airport, he caught sight of a group of people in a corner, gathered around their phones, replaying the footage of him being humiliated by Officer James. One of them, a young man in his early 20s, was scrolling through the video on his phone. His name was Chris, a social activist known for his advocacy against discrimination and injustice. As he watched the footage of John being mistreated, a surge of indignation burned in his chest. "This is unacceptable!" Chris shouted, loud enough for those around him to hear. His outburst drew the attention of others in the area, and soon a small crowd began to form, drawn by Chris's passionate reaction. John had been just one person, quietly enduring a moment of injustice. But with Chris's shout, something shifted. The seeds of a movement had been planted. The videos that had been recorded, the murmurs of discontent, and the rallying cries of a few individuals were beginning to take root. What had begun as a private indignity was now a public call for change. Chris, with his platform and influence, knew he had to act. He started sharing the footage on social media, reaching out to other activists and organizations. The injustice John had faced was becoming the symbol of a larger issue: racial profiling, power abuse, and systemic discrimination that many had suffered for far too long. As Chris shared the video, the reactions poured in from all corners. People across the country, even across the world, began to speak up. The story was no longer just about John. It was about every person who had ever been unjustly treated, every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of their background, their appearance, or their history. And John, though he hadn't sought the spotlight, had unwittingly become the face of a movement that was born out of pain and frustration, but fueled by the hope of a better, fairer society. As the wave of support for John grew, so did the resolve of those who had witnessed the injustice. Change was coming, and it was coming fast. Chris, quickly typed up a post on social media, his fingers moving with urgency. He wanted the world to see the injustice that had just unfolded in front of his eyes. Why is a former Marine treated like this because of the color of his skin? Racism, right at the airport. This is John Carter, a man who fought for this country. Shame. Within minutes, his post exploded across social media, receiving hundreds of shares. Chris's words resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. Meanwhile, John had no idea that his name was now at the center of an online storm. As he waited for his flight, videos of the confrontation between him and Officer James quickly went viral, sparking a wave of outrage. Thousands of comments flooded in. He is a hero. Why is he being treated like this? We need to change. This system, no one should be humiliated because of the color of their skin. I knew John Carter. He was my commander in the army. He was a great man. Stories of John's bravery and dedication in the Marine Corps began to spread like wildfire. The more people learned about him, the more his story became a symbol of both injustice and compassion. The outpouring of support turned John into an emblem of courage, dignity, and the fight against systemic racism. Chris, who had posted the initial story, received a private message from a journalist at a major television network. "We would like to interview Mr. Carter," the message read. Chris immediately sprang into action. He knew John had to hear the good news. He made his way to the waiting area where he spotted John sitting quietly by the window, his gaze distant, focused on the runway ahead. The man seemed lost in thought, but when Chris approached, John turned his head with curiosity. "Mr. Carter," Chris called softly. John looked at him, his expression neutral. "Who are you?" "I'm Chris," he replied. "I filmed your mistreatment at the security area and posted it online. Now your story is getting a lot of attention. I want you to know that everyone is on your side." John was taken aback, but he kept his composure. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said slowly. "I just want to be treated fairly like every other citizen." Chris nodded, understanding. "And that's why people are rooting for you. Journalists have asked to interview you. Would you like to share your story?" John paused, thinking carefully. He wasn't looking for fame or attention, but there was something about this moment that felt important. If his story could make a difference, if it could change the way people thought about justice and equality, he was willing to speak up. "I don't do this for fame or attention," John said thoughtfully. "But if my story can help change the way people treat others, then I'm willing." Within hours, John's story had spread across television channels and online newspapers. The media outlets picked up the story, and reporters from all over the country reached out to the airport for confirmation. The intense scrutiny forced the airport management to issue an official statement. "We deeply regret this unfortunate incident," the statement read. "We are conducting an internal investigation to ensure that law enforcement officers followed proper procedures and did not engage in discriminatory behavior." But the statement did little to quell the growing public outrage. Human rights organizations, veterans groups, and concerned citizens all joined in the chorus of voices, demanding justice for John. They called for a formal apology and a concrete action plan to ensure that no one else would face such treatment in the future. Meanwhile, Officer James, the police officer responsible for the incident, found himself under intense scrutiny. Both his superiors and the public were now watching his every move. The online backlash had thrust his name into the center of a storm of criticism. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that this incident was not going to be swept under the rug. As the story gained momentum, it became more than just a single act of injustice. It became a powerful symbol of the need for change. John Carter's quiet bravery had sparked something far bigger than he could have imagined. The outcry was not only about what had happened to him, but also about the larger systemic issues of racial profiling and inequality that continued to persist in society. And as the voices of support for John grew louder, so did the call for real, meaningful change. "How can you treat someone who served the country like this?" one social media user wrote, expressing the widespread outrage over John Carter's treatment. Officer James was now under immense pressure. Forced to take a leave of absence as the investigation unfolded, he felt the weight of the constant criticism. His every action was being scrutinized, and, unable to argue back, he knew that the incident had been clearly recorded, leaving him with little room to defend himself. The day after the incident, John agreed to appear on live television. Dressed in a neat suit, he sat across from the host, his demeanor calm and composed despite the media frenzy surrounding him. "Mr. Carter," the host began, "how do you feel about this going viral?" John took a deep breath and replied, his voice steady. "I'm not happy about being the center of attention in this way, but I believe this is an opportunity for us to discuss the larger issue. How we treat each other, not just at the airport, but in every aspect of our lives." The host continued, pressing the topic. "Do you think you were treated that way because of the color of your skin?" John looked directly into the camera, his gaze unwavering. "I can't read people's minds, but their actions speak volumes, and those actions need to change." As the interview came to a close, John left a powerful message that resonated with viewers everywhere. "This is not just about me. This is about everyone who has been treated unfairly. I hope this story will be the beginning of change." His words spread rapidly, stirring sympathy and inspiring many to join the conversation about reforming the security system and law enforcement. The wave of public opinion continued to grow, preparing for the story's climactic moment. For days, John Carter's story had dominated social media and the press. The image of him, a former Marine, juxtaposed with the harrowing footage from the airport created a stark contrast that captivated the public. People were not only outraged, but also demanding concrete actions to ensure that similar incidents did not happen again. Under the mounting pressure, the airport management called a press conference to address the issue. Senior Supervisor, Mr. Marcus Hill, stepped forward with a public apology. "We apologize to Mr. John Carter and to anyone who was hurt by this incident. The behavior of some of our employees does not reflect the values and standards to which we are committed. We will work to ensure similar situations do not occur in the future." While the public apology helped calm some of the anger, it wasn't enough to satisfy everyone. Human rights organizations and veterans groups called for more substantial changes, including reforming the airport security staff training system to prevent such incidents from happening again. Meanwhile, Officer James found himself at the center of the storm. The internal investigation quickly led to his suspension. During a private meeting with airport management, James expressed remorse for his actions, but the damage had already been done. His name had become synonymous with the abuse of power, and the public outcry left him with little hope of escaping the consequences of his actions. As the investigation continued, the story of John Carter, a former Marine who had once fought for the country, became more than just a viral moment. It became a call to action, a demand for change that could no longer be ignored. And while the journey was far from over, the seeds of reform had been planted, and the public's attention was firmly fixed on the fight for justice. "I didn't mean to discriminate. I just followed the screening process," James insisted. But this explanation was not enough to undo the harm that had been done. As a result, James was required to attend cultural sensitivity and fair treatment training, as well as write a formal letter of apology to John Carter. While all this was unfolding, John Carter didn't let the public attention be limited to just his personal story. He received an invitation to speak at a prominent conference focused on equality and social justice, attended by numerous activists, business leaders, and government officials. During his speech, John began by recounting the airport incident, but soon expanded the conversation to something much broader. "My story is just one small example of the countless stories we never hear about," he said, his voice resolute. "The system needs to change, not just for me, but for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or social class. We need to train people to not only do a good job, but also to treat people with respect." His words resonated deeply, with his message quoted by the media and widely shared. The hashtag "Learning from John Carter" trended on social media, and millions rallied behind the call for reform in the security and law enforcement systems. Faced with growing public pressure, The airport authority responded by announcing a series of reforms: improved training. All security personnel would now be required to attend courses on cultural sensitivity, effective communication, and conflict management. Closer monitoring, more. Cameras would be installed at security checkpoints to ensure transparency and accountability. Clear complaints mechanism. A new system would be established to allow passengers to easily report inappropriate behavior. These changes would not only apply at the airport in question, but also serve as a model for other airports to follow. Weeks after the incident, John received a letter from James. In the letter, James expressed his sincere remorse. "Dear Mr. Carter, I am writing to offer my sincerest apologies. I was wrong, and I now realize that my actions were inexcusable. Through my training and what I've learned from your story, I have come to understand that my ignorance and unconscious bias led me to act in the wrong way. I hope you can forgive me, and I promise to do everything I can to ensure this never happens again. You have taught me a great lesson about respect and human dignity." John read the letter with mixed emotions. While he couldn't erase the past, he understood that change began with recognizing mistakes. John's story became much more than just an isolated incident at the airport. It evolved into a symbol of reform and the ongoing fight for equality. He continued to use his voice to advocate for awareness of discrimination and human rights. John worked with organizations to develop training materials for law enforcement and security personnel, helping them better understand the importance of treating people with dignity and respect. James, after completing his training, was given a second chance to return to work. But this time, he came back with a different attitude: more dedication, more sensitivity. He even became an advocate for cultural sensitivity training programs, sharing his personal experience to help others avoid making the same mistakes. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and share this story with your friends and family. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful story.